Now, the United Nations Security Council held an open debate on leadership for peace to focus on promoting multilateralism to help achieve peace across the globe. Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the wars in Ukraine, Gaza and Sudan are undermining the legitimacy and effectiveness of the Security Council. He said the Pact for Peace will help strengthen multilateralism and strengthen the Security Council. The Secretary General said the pact sends a clear message to the warring parties that all members of this council, including the 5 permanent members, will not tolerate the horrific violence and desperate humanitarian crisis being unleashed on innocent civilians.
To Sudan and beyond, wars grind on, suffering grows, anger deepens, lives are upended, and legitimacy and effectiveness of the United Nations and this Council are undermined. Leadership for peace means all member states living up to their commitments in the UN Charter, in international law, and in recent agreements such as the Pact for the Future. Among other things, the Pact calls for strengthening tools and frameworks to prevent conflict, sustain peace, and advance sustainable development with the full, equal and meaningful participation of women. Leadership for peace means ensuring that the UN Security Council acts in a meaningful way to ease global tensions and help address the conflicts that are inflicting so much suffering around the world. Geopolitical divisions continue to block effective solutions. A united council can make a tremendous difference for peace. A divided council cannot. When you consider the most difficult and intractable conflicts on this Council agenda, peace can seem an impossible dream. But I strongly believe that peace is possible if we stick to principles. Peace in Ukraine is possible by following the UN Charter and abiding by international law. Peace in Gaza is possible by sparing no efforts for an immediate ceasefire, the immediate release of all hostages, and the beginning of an irreversible process towards a two-state solution. Peace in Sudan is possible by sending a clear message to the warring parties that all members of this Council, including the 5 permanent members, will not tolerate the horrific violence and desperate humanitarian crisis being unleashed on innocent civilians.
Right, for the very latest, let's cross live to New York and speak to Arise international correspondent Adefemi Akinsanya. Great to see you, Femi, as always. Well, it does seem like peace is on the mind of the United Nations, but tell us what's the latest on the UN, NGF, what's on the agenda?
Thank you, Ngozi. It's always a pleasure to hear your face. You know, between the two of us, you're definitely one of my favorites. So it's always a pleasure to be able to be speaking to you every single time. Good to see you. Good to hear from you, Ngozi. Let's talk about what's been happening at UNGA today. I know you touched on the NGF, and we will talk about Nigeria specifically. But let's start on a more global footing. Firstly, we did hear the comments from Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, and he says that he believes that Israel should be stripped of its United Nations membership because it is failing to participate in efforts to move towards a two-state solution. It is the latest that we've been hearing in terms of what the issues are dominating this edition of United Nations, and it is of course what is happening in the Middle East. Israel continues its bombardment not only of targets in Gaza and other Palestinian lands, but indeed what we're seeing in Lebanon. The situation in Lebanon is escalating so quickly that there are fears that they're a whisker away from all-out war. And so what we're seeing here at the UN Security Council, different members discussing their plight and their issues on the stage at the general debate is very much an ending of the rope, essentially, coming to the end of their tether. A lot of patience waning because a lot of people are struggling to understand why it is that coming to the negotiating table is so difficult. Israel's UN ambassador spoke to journalists, spoke to the public here on the grounds of the United Nations yesterday, and in his speech He talks about how Israel is going to continue on in this desire for its own self-preservation, its own protection, and also trying its hardest to get the remaining hostages back into Israel alive and well as soon as possible. But the destruction and the devastation that we're seeing is tantamount to genocide. It's a recurring theme, and it continues on and on. So that's definitely been dominating conversations here, especially topped off with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas is his address, and how he says that we will not leave Palestine, that it is our homeland. So again, when we're coming to the discussion table, we have to understand that Palestine is not interested in any type of deal or any type of situation that will see them continue to evacuate their own lands. As we heard the president say, they are not leaving. Palestine is their land. Well, now let's move on to what we're seeing in Nigeria specifically. There's been actually very interesting developments ongoing right now as I speak to you. Is at the United Nations NGF, a sub-national governments meeting. They're calling it a governors forum, and essentially you do have a lot of Nigerian governors, Governor of Niger State, the Governor of Plateau State, the Governor of Benue State, and lots of commissioners from different areas as well participating, sitting down at a table, discussing the matters of the day. And the theme of the discussion at that Governors Forum that's going on downstairs just now is looking at sustainable solutions to problems that we're seeing across the landscape in Nigeria. The focus, of course, is looking at sustainable development goals. And what we saw is different governors and commissioners present their case for their specific states, for their specific communities, in how they wish to achieve certain sustainable development goals and how it is that they want the UN to support them as they go about it. Niger State government did a really interesting breakdown of all of the different policies in its own state, looking at arable land, the fact that it's an agrarian economy, looking at the positive aspects of how it can harness its own capital when it comes to agricultural land and these types of developments there. So it does seem as though Nigeria is ably being represented at this meeting, and there does seem to be a lot of genuine concern, a lot of genuine desire to make their communities, to make their states better places. Ngozi.
Absolutely. Well, let's hope the presence of the governors will make positive impact, will result in some kind of positive impact at the subnational level when they come back home. Now, African leaders have been taking the center stage over the past few days. What exactly has been the consensus in their remarks?
Well, looking at consensus with a lot of African heads of state, they are really focused on this United Nations Security Council. As it stands, the United Nations Security Council has 9 seats, and it's documented and occupied those seats by the quote-unquote usual characters, the likes of the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia too. And essentially what global leaders, especially African leaders, have been calling for is a seat at that table. And the prospect, the deal on the table, the opportunity that's being thrown about is the prospect for 2 extra seats, permanent seats, to be added to the UN Security Council. Now, roughly speaking, these 2 seats should go to one African country and perhaps another country in the global south, perhaps a Latin American country, perhaps a South Asian country. But what we're seeing, though, is that if you push past the surface of this offering of a prospect of 2 different seats, there's the understanding that these new seats that would be occupied by an African country at least, if these theories are correct, would not enjoy the power of having a veto like other countries. So immediately that highlights issues of inequalities and inequities. And again, if we're talking about the United Nations as being the geopolitical pope, for lack of a better term, how can it be that some countries are deserving of real power, soft power, hard power, and respect, but other ones aren't? How is it that we are discussing the fact that many countries believe that this Security Council needs an overhaul, and the prospect on the table is, yes, okay, you can sit with us, but you don't actually have any real tangible power? And the irony really isn't lost on many communities in Africa. If we look at Kenya, for example, just this week, Kenya has deployed 600 police officers to Haiti to help fight the gangland violence happening there. And they're not doing it, of course, they're doing it to help the community there, but they're also trying to establish a fully fledged UN peacekeeping mission, and they can only do that if the UN Security Council approves it. The UN Security Council has obviously been meeting during UNGA, but it's believed that meetings towards the end of this month will directly give an answer about whether or not Kenya can establish a UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti. And if it does do so, it means off the back of that there will be far more funding, a lot more powers, because one of the greatest challenges that Haitian security forces are facing in this internal violence is a lack of resources, a lack of adequate equipment. So again, okay, if the United Nations Security Council is talking about the prospect of establishing this peacekeeping mission, surely an African country should be at the table discussing it. It does feel as though there is truly an imbalance and an unfairness if that's not the case. And then where we're talking about conflict and internal crises in a country, and how there is so much talk about a lack of funding, a lack of resources, the inability of a national police force to keep each other safe, when you juxtapose that with what we're seeing in Israel, the fact that their powerful allies, the United States, the United Kingdom, continue to support them politically, continue to support them with their rhetoric and their language, and continue to support them with money and weapons, it does feel a little bitter that somehow there is all of this money and all of these weapons for these types of conflicts, but not for what we're seeing in Haiti. So it is a little uncomfortable, and I think that reignites conversations about the relevance of the United Nations in general. Sure, Absolutely. It is a wonderful time of the year to see international politics being discussed at length. But how far does this rhetoric go? How far do these words go if it doesn't turn into or translate into real change, real development for everybody? We talk so much about the developing world, about the global south, but it does seem as though there has to be more of an effort to establish us and move these communities away from that type of dependence, this truly independence that many countries, many heads of states have been talking about. So Absolutely. I do think that perhaps as we draw towards the end of High Level Week and the end of this edition of the United Nations General Assembly, perhaps there are going to be far more questions asked about the relevance of this institution, about whether or not they do have the power to end the international crisis that we're seeing. Right. Are we going to end this edition of UNGA with Israel still being able to bombard these communities?
So many
questions. Are we going to be, again, talking about a Security Council that doesn't have a seat at the table, a permanent seat at the table for African countries? I mean, many, many questions that still are waiting to be answered.
Absolutely. And, well, not much time left. Adefemi, wish we could get any reaction, if you're getting any whispers in terms of response to that call by Nigeria that African nations need debt forgiveness. Let's leave that question for another day. Adefemi Akinsanya, Arise international correspondent at UNGA 79. Thanks for joining us as always.
Always a pleasure.